residents of Second Life, their avatars are themselves, and the actions of their avatars, their actions, might be true. So the view that I looked at in the previous section gives us some helpful insights into this, insofar as these two sort of separate narratives can be thought of as cohering together. So when it comes to Second Life and real life, the narratives of the offline and online user, they are distinct. We can say that for sure. But like, my unified narrative, Sheckman's trying to point out that there's two sort of ways that we can notice how they're distinct narratives and how Second Life and real life can interact with one another. So she says these two are, quote, the impact of the avatar narrative on the user and the user narrative on, and the user narrative impact on the avatar narrative. So I'm just going to talk about the first one, and the second one is way more important. So let's just blow through the first one. So essentially the way that the possible examples for the first would be, she says, quote, musicians whose avatars perform in Second Life and can get recording contracts and their users can get real life gigs on the basis of the avatars following. What's more, art created in the real life can be displayed and sold in Second Life if it's electronically based, and vice versa, end quote. So on the other hand, we have the more intimate and more important sort of relationship, and that is between the narrative of the user and the narrative of the Second Life avatar. And so this is just going to be a little bit before I go into my supplementation of her view. So one of these instances that we actually see is essentially, oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. So a lot of these, you guys might know away from keyboard, so AFK. That's one that we have seen before. And another one that you guys might have heard about is just BRB. So she gives an example here that I'm just going to quote at length before I go into my sections. So this is actually from an author named Tom Bolsdorf, and he's playing with someone in SL, Second Life, and her name is Trishy. And so Sheckman says, quote, after telling him that mommy left us lunch, Trishy excused herself. BRB, be right back, gotta check the meatloaf. So Bolsdorf continues, reflecting that they were talking about virtual food in her playhouse when she suddenly said she had to go away from keyboard and would be right back because she had to check an actual world meatloaf in an actual world oven. So Trishy had told me earlier that in the actual world, she was a mother with 2 children. She was preparing food for her actual world children while her virtual world parents had left her food in her Second Life. Sorry, reading that always makes me laugh a little bit. So the way that these the second way that I'm talking about here, the way that the narrative of the user can impact the narrative of the avatar is more important and more different for Sheckman. And in a sense, it helps us understand how a shift in a character's narrative, we can explain this insofar as as there could be a new actor author, but the characters themselves doing so within the fictional narrative, as we've already kind of seen in other talks today, it's really postmodern. And Sheckman says, quote, only in works explicitly aimed at breaking down the boundaries between fiction and reality. So it doesn't really make sense to do that a lot. But essentially the question here is whether there's any metaphysical, meaningful sense that we can actually understand these two narratives as cohering together. And so essentially, she gives us an analogy to think about this. And I'm just going to go into this before I conclude with my examples that I want to bring a little bit forward and I think we can apply them here. So essentially, she tells us to imagine this husband who's going away on a Vegas trip with his buddies, and we can understand how these two narratives would be separate. He has his Vegas narrative, and then we also have the everyday life. And so what essentially this demonstrates for Sheckman's view is that in these online contexts as well, self-narration is an extremely complicated domain. And so she says, quote, it is not just a matter of thinking about various events, implicitly as mine or not mine. So the context also matters. The narrative of a life can be one with multiple subplots, digressions, and deviations from the main narrative stream. It need not be linear in any simple way. So essentially, I think that what we can do is supplement her approach, even though this is going to be very vague. I think we can see already like some real world examples, even though it's not the same as Second Life. I think we can still see some things happening, especially with COVID. So Dario, for example, MIT was actually reconstructed on Minecraft. by a lot of the students so that they could do essentially a virtual graduation. And this was also done at UC Berkeley, UCLA, U of Penn, and Northwestern. And this one here is actually, it looks, just like nothing, but this is actually the University of Washington. It's their architecture hall that they recreated. So essentially, what I want to talk about, just to conclude very briefly, is how these could possibly provide another analogy for working within Sheckman's narrative view, and the way that we can understand these, it's not exactly a second life, but how we can possibly understand these examples as digressions of a larger narrative. So I understand that Minecraft is just a game. I'm actually wearing my brother's headset right now, and I've seen them goof around with it. And it really, you have to, I think this is a very important example because you have to take it seriously. That's kind of her point. And with this, it really matters when we take the context seriously. So we've already heard a lot today. We had and I'm just culminating thoughts here, but we had a really good keynote about how data is scraped from internet, Pinterest and that kind of stuff. And even just right now, my body is being visualized by, they're extracting the data. And so I want to conclude a little bit by talking about how this is going to impinge on our privacy. And essentially, I'm going to draw a little bit from an author named Michael Lynch. And essentially what I want to conclude with talking about is the difference between freedom of autonomy and personal autonomy. So freedom of choice is usually thought by philosophers as just like, freely clicking on something. And our economy is sort of built like that. We actually like having these sort of things available to us, but autonomy is a decision that's actually mine. So it's something that you own in a way that you would reflect upon. And sure, philosophers have debated about whether these things are actually possible at all. But I think this gives us some sort of insight into thinking about how our autonomy might be undermined in this way that they're extracting the data. So Lynch gives us a really helpful example. So essentially, you imagine someone breaks into your house and reads your diary every day over and over and over again. And even if you never learn that they're doing this, it still harms you in a way by undermining your capacity to control your information. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. So this kind of connection to some might not be surprising at all. Like we click those, the privacy things, the contracts very quickly just because we want to sacrifice some sort of autonomy. But I think that Lynch is right that this is sort of the wrong reasoning, because this essentially, builds off of Sheckman's point that we can actually consider these narratives that are being, extracted data from, they're part of us. And so I just want to conclude with some thoughts about how you actually mentioned, I mentioned Strawson. And one thing that I think that this really is a problem, it gives us some philosophical trouble as to go back to Dr. Shea's comments. It treats us as not persons anymore. So this is actually what Strawson called the objective attitude. And I think that this essentially, this is what's happening. So if we cease to treat our online narratives as genuine parts of who we are as persons, and if we treat us, as Strawson says, of the objective attitude, quote, as an object of social policy to be managed, handled, controlled, cured, or trained, end quote, then I think this is something that Sheckman's discussion, we shouldn't just leave her narrative view at that. And I hope that it wasn't too long. I'm really looking forward to answering any questions. And that's a picture I really like. And thank you. There are my references.